Hello, this is Dr. Heather Lee, and this is a fourth video on assessment for EDS 318. And in the last video, we talked about pre-assessment and gave many different strategies for getting data about your students so that you can use it to plan instruction. And let me begin with reinforcing that. Don't forget, when you get pre-assessment, when you get data, when you try to figure out beforehand what your students know, don't forget to use it to plan instruction that's specifically geared for your individual students, not just the whole group, because remember, that group of students, they're very different, and they all are coming from with different levels of knowledge, different background knowledge, different achievement levels. So your students are individuals, so you need to know how to gear instruction towards many different individuals. And in this video, we're going to talk about formative and summative assessments. So let's begin with formative. This is used during instruction to check how the students are doing, if they're learning, how well they're learning. Wiggins and McTee call these daily teacher checks, and they say that these daily teacher checks are the vehicles through which we use to monitor whether our students understand. These might be graded, quizzes, homework assignments, those are formative assessment along the way, or they might not be graded. It's really up to you at the time and what is best for your students. Now, as you think about formative assessment, I want you to think about the word formative. It means that something is capable of molding or shaping something. And imagine a lump of clay, and your students' brains are like that lump of clay at the beginning. And at the beginning with pre-assessment, you size up that lump of clay and you find out how close is this to the end product. Suppose your end product is a lovely vase, okay? How do you get your student from that lump of clay to the beautiful vase? You put your hands on and you start molding, you start changing and shifting. And it doesn't make any sense really for someone to mold that clay and never look at it, never size it up and say, how is it going? How much closer are they to the end product than they were at the beginning? And that's what this formative assessment does. You begin to mold your students' minds, and you keep watching them and checking them and finding out how they're doing along the way. Now, there are 3 words to describe our formative assessment. It should be specific. Sometimes we give very general comments, maybe on homework assignments like, good job, nice, I like it, instead of things like good use of descriptive verbs, or you really understand the sequence of that time in history, very well written. That's much more specific, and it's more useful to students. It also should be timely. And what that means is that the sooner they get feedback, the better. The more time that goes by when students hand in something for formative assessment, even if it's a little journal entry, the more time that goes by before they hear back from you, the less value what you have to say is. You know, they don't really remember it anymore, and they may not even read or understand what you say. So if you can get it the very next day to them or within 2 days, that timeliness is very helpful. And the third and most difficult to understand is criterion referenced. Now, criterion reference means that you're not comparing them to other students. You're comparing them to criteria, to a standard. It's not saying you were in the top 10% or you're getting it better than others. It's saying, here's how you measure up according to what I asked for. So it's based on criteria, based on a standard. So formative assessment should be specific, timely, and criterion referenced. Now let me quickly go through some ideas for formative assessments. One is called EPR, every pupil response. This is when during your teaching you have everybody, for example, vote on something by raising their hands, and you might say, how many of you have ever blah blah blah, or who thinks that was a good thing to do? And so everybody either raises or doesn't raise their hand. You might have them answer all at once, that's choral answering, or think, pair, share, where you give a question, they turn to a partner and they discuss it. And the most important thing about this is that you're getting a response from every pupil. You're drawing them in, and you are watching how well are my students understanding what I'm doing. It could be homework or work that they do in class. There are quizzes. Another one is called the 1-minute essay. This is where you have them stop, and for 1 minute you ask them to write about something specific. It could be at the end of class you say, what's the big point of our lesson today? What's the most important thing you learned today? Or summarize what we did today in one sentence. That's called a 1-minute essay. Index card summaries. Many ways to do this, but one way is you give them all an index card towards, maybe the end of a class session or the end of a major point. And on the first side, they summarize the big idea of what they learned today. And then on the back, you have them identify something they don't quite understand. They write one question for you. Then you could read that night or scan through them quickly and use that to clarify anything that needs to be clarified when you start the next class session the following day or the day after that. There's using an analogy prompt. This is higher level thinking. This is where you say, blank is like blank because blank. For example, assessment is like learning because it never ends. You would basically have them take a topic, maybe it's warfare, and you would have them try to think, warfare is like blank because blank. They're making their own analogy. And that would be very challenging. It would help you to understand whether they even get, what warfare is and what you're talking about. And those could be shared out loud, or they could just be written down on a card and turned in at the end of the day. Another idea is to have your students check in at the bottom of their homework. Possibly before they turn it in, you have them just write at the bottom, this is blank. This is easy, this is confusing, this is complicated. Or maybe if you typed out the homework and you gave it to them, a worksheet, you could add something to the bottom where they just literally checked one of these. I get it, I think I get it, or I don't get this. And then when you look at it, you'll get an understanding of how confident they are in their learning. Students could make a visual. You could have them stop and sketch or draw a picture to see how well they understand it. You could ask them questions. This is probably the most traditional thing that we do. There are exit slips, a little slip of paper with maybe 1 or 2 questions that students have to fill out and give to you before they leave the classroom. Some students do the exit slip, teachers do an exit slip. Others just have them have a question and they have to answer it as they walk out the door. So you stand at the door and you have asked the question, and it's a 1-word answer that they have to give you as they leave the door. That may or may not work in your situation. There are student journals, and there's also observation, where your students are working and you're walking around and observing them, and not just in general observing, but trying to be a very targeted observer. You're looking for specific things to find out how well they understand. So that is formative assessment. You're forming their brains as you go through a lesson, and you want to know along the way, how are my students doing? So we have, don't forget to use that formative assessment. You're using it to monitor their learning, to give them feedback, to let them know how well they're doing, and then to make changes. They could be immediate changes where you slow down or you speed up or you re-explain something, or they might be changes that you make to the next lesson, the next day of instruction. So we have pre-assessment, we have formative assessment, and finally we have summative assessment. And this is the easiest to understand. This is the one we have all been doing for years, and it's the more traditional. Summative assessment is used at the end of instruction. It's almost always graded, and it's some type of a culminating experience. And let me tell you that you may have more than one type of summative assessment. For example, in EDS 318, not only will you have a final exam at the end, that's more not only book knowledge, but also your understanding in words of the key principles of this course, but you will also have the unit plan and the TWS, which is a much different type of summative assessment, but they are both meant to be culminating experiences. So just going through a few of these, there is your classic test. There's a project, a portfolio. A portfolio is where you collect many different pieces of students' work. For example, a writing teacher may be building a portfolio for students, or have their students build a portfolio, where maybe at the end of every unit, the students produce one piece of writing and they give it their best effort. It's edited, other peers look at it, the teacher grades it, it's redone, and then that gets put into the portfolio as an example of a student's best work. So by the end of the year, there may be 10 pieces in a portfolio. You probably know that artists have portfolios, summaries of their samples of their best work. It may be a report or a paper, a more traditional route. It also could be considered the ACT, the SAT, standardized testing. That is a type of summative assessment as well. But don't forget, whatever the summative assessment is, and this is actually not done as much as it should be. We kind of view summative assessment as, hey, we're done. I have to have a test, I do a main grade, but then we don't do anything. We don't give feedback and we don't do anything with those results. But those results should be used to give feedback to students, to reteach things if necessary, maybe in a small group, maybe just a catch-up session where you realize there are a few objectives that truly were not learned well. So you take the time with some students to go over that, and then to determine student learning. To once and for all say, okay, here are my learning goals, here's my summative assessment compared to my pre-assessment. How well did my students learn those objectives? So use the results of all of your assessment data in order to create the best possible lessons, in order to change lessons as you go along, and then in order to determine how well your students learned. Thank you. Hope you enjoyed this teaching on assessment, and next we'll be moving on to actually making and crafting your own assessments. This is the final video for assessment part 1.